Hello, this is Sam Fries. I'm a NC State student in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program, and this is a species spotlight video on one of my personal favorites, the big brown bat, Eptesicus fuscus. The big brown bat is in the kingdom the phylum Chordata, and it's a vertebrate, so it's in the subphylum Vertebrata. The big brown bat is a mammal, so it's in the class Mammalia. And then if we further break it down, it's in the order Chiroptera. All bats are in the order Chiroptera. And then there's two suborders within Chiroptera, Microchiroptera and Megachiroptera, which I'll go into more detail later. But the big brown bat is in Microchiroptera. Chiroptera, which again is the order that all bats are in, means handwing in Latin, and is referring to the structure of a bat's wing. Their arm and finger bones are analogous to human arm and finger bones. They're just very elongated. So again, back to the Microchiroptera versus Megachiroptera. These are the two suborders. Microchiroptera are all of the New World bats, which includes North and South America. And microchiropterans are also called echolocating bats because most of them echolocate. Megachiroptera are the Old World bats, also called the fruit bats. And they're found mostly in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Most of the megachiropterans cannot echolocate, but there are a couple exceptions. And this system is actually being currently revisited. They're starting to do more genetics work on bats, and they're thinking about reclassifying these two orders into Yintochiroptera and Yangochiroptera. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out down the road. The big brown bat is in the Vespertilionidae family, which is the largest family of bats in the world with over 300 described species on every continent except for Antarctica. And then we have the genus Eptesicus, which means house bat, basically, and it includes 25 different species. And then fuscus means dark in Latin, and it's referring to the dark brown coloration. The big brown bat ranges from southern Canada throughout all of North America, down through most of Central America, and to the extreme northern portion of South America, as well as the West Indies. The big brown bat is considered globally secure, and in fact it's a very common bat across most of its range. Where habitat conditions are right, they're oftentimes the primary bat species found. And then white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease killing bats in North America, is not considered a serious threat to Eptesicus fuscus. The big brown bat tends to be, since it's a little bit larger and a little bit hardier than some of the other species like the myotis bats, they're really being wiped out by white nose syndrome. The big browns aren't really affected as much by white nose syndrome. They're still being killed, but it's not quite as serious of a threat. Okay, so the big brown bat is relatively easy to identify in the field. A lot of bats can be very difficult, but the big brown bat is pretty easy. It's a large dark brown bat with almost a dog-like face is how I kind of describe it. I think they look kind of like little flying werewolves. And they have these short black leathery ears with broad rounded trachea, and the trachea are these right there. You can see it right here as well. The interfemoral membranes, which are the wing and tail membranes, are a blackish brown color and almost entirely devoid of fur. They weigh between 13 and 20. Big brown bats, their lifespan isn't really well understood, but we think that they can live up to 19 years in the wild, which is a really, really long time for an animal that small. And one of the main reasons that bats may be able to live so long is that they spend a significant portion of their lives sleeping, basically, since they hibernate. Um, Mating occurs from September to March, and the females actually delay fertilization until right before they emerge from hibernation. Um, and then they give birth somewhere between May through July. Typically, big brown bats have a litter size of 1 to 2, with 1 being more typical. And those young are capable of flight typically 18 to 35 days post-birth. The males become sexually mature within 6 months, but the females don't typically reproduce during their first year. They wait until their second year. Big brown bats typically start foraging just after sunset. Different species emerge at different times, but typically bat activity peaks right after sunset, about halfway through the night, and then again right before sunrise. Big brown bats follow this pattern, but most of their foraging activity occurs within 2 hours after sunset. Big brown bats primarily eat beetles from the order Coleoptera, but they also eat a lot of moths from the order Lepidoptera, as well as adult caddisflies from the order Trichoptera. And it's really cool. Big brown bats, along with other bats, use their tail membranes and sometimes also their wings, kind of like catcher's mitts, like a catcher's mitt to catch insects in mid-flight. They'll fly at the insect and they'll invert themselves and cup their tail membrane and catch the insect in their tail membrane and then transfer it up into their mouth. It's really, really cool to watch. Big brown bats forage over urban areas, open ground, forest canopies, forest edges, wetlands, and you can also find them foraging over calm water. If you see a large brown bat flying around your neighborhood in the early evening, there's a really good chance it's a big brown bat. They're really common in urban areas, and they're one of the most common bats to find roosting in people's houses. Big brown bats typically hibernate from November to March or April, and they usually hibernate either by themselves or in small clusters within caves, mines, storm sewers, or buildings. The females then emerge in March and April and form maternity colonies, and these maternity colonies usually have 25 to 75 adults. But anywhere from 500 to 700 adult females have been observed in these maternity colonies, and they're typically in caves, mines, buildings, tree cavities, rock crevices, and sometimes even in bat houses. The male big brown bats typically roost by themselves, but sometimes they'll form all-male colonies. And these maternity colonies usually break up in August, but the big brown bats don't actually start showing up to hibernacula until November. Another way to identify big brown bats is to set out bat detectors and record their ultrasonic echolocation pulses. And you can take that information and plot it on a spectrogram, which is shown here. And you can identify the call down to species most of the time. Now, acoustic identification of bats gets really, really complicated, and there's still a lot of error involved in it because we don't understand a whole lot about it yet. But I'm going to give you a typical example of a big brown bat call here and how to tell you how to identify it. This call was recorded in a low clutter environment, which means it was out in the open. Bats, since echolocation is a functional navigational aid, it changes depending on the environment. And typically when you're recording a bat call that you want to ID to species, you want it to be a low clutter call because those calls tend to be easier to identify. So a big brown bat, they're call pulses. This is one pulse right here, and I call this whole thing the call sequence. Each of their pulses tends to be fairly steep, whereas other bats, it'll be much flatter, or in the case of myotis bats, it'll be very, very steep. And the sort of characteristic frequency or the bottom of the echolocation call is typically around a frequency of 25 kilohertz. And they kind of have one of the characteristics that I look for in big brown bat calls is this sort of droopy appearance. Each of the pulses has sort of like this little droopy tail right on the bottom end of the echolocation pulse. So a frequency of around 25 to 30 kilohertz, a fairly steep call, and a droopy tail on the end is typically what I look for when I'm identifying a big brown bat call. Thank you for watching. This is a big brown bat that I captured up in Virginia over the summer when I was working on a bat survey. Thanks.